Well, good morning. Good morning, everyone. I see some folks are connecting to audio, so I'll wait a few seconds. Well, good morning and welcome to the annual Carroll Citizens for Racial Equality Bridging the Gap Conference, this year titled Our Country 'Tis of Thee. Now, this is our first virtual conference. My name is Erin Snell and I'm the chair of CCRE. Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that this conference is being recorded and broadcast live. So if you wish, you can rename yourselves. You can also turn off your camera. So Carroll County Citizens for Racial Equality seeks to promote racial equality and improve understanding in Carroll County through community networking, public education at the grassroots level, and positive opportunities for discourse. CCRE has been committed to this work for 28 years. I'd like to give special thanks to McDaniel College Social Work Department for making it possible for licensed social workers and counselors to earn continuing education units by attending this conference. Thanks goes also to St. Paul's United Church of Christ for being the Zoom host this morning. And many, many, many thanks to the Community Media Center of Carroll County for recording this broadcast and rebroadcasting and broadcasting live. And we also want to thank all the organizations that participate in CCRE. We have Carroll County Public Schools, Carroll County Public Library, Carroll County Health Department, Carroll Community College, Carroll County Youth Service Bureau, Carroll Coalition of the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project, Carroll County Human Relations Commission, the Islamic Society of Carroll County, McDaniel College, our NAACP Chapter 7014, PFLAG Westminster Carroll County, St. Paul's United Church of Christ, and the ZEP Center for Nonviolence and Peace Education. So for those of you who have attended our conference in the past, you know that usually our conference is longer and there's free continental breakfast and lunch provided. So I'm sorry that we cannot share pizza, salad, and cookies today with you, but we are hoping that we will be able to when our next conference comes up again in the spring. So enough talk from me. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who is an amazing woman who many of us greatly admire. She is persistent and full of grace. She is tenacious and dedicated to making our Carroll County community a more inclusive place to live and work. She has served on the Board of Education and hopefully will do so again soon. And she serves in many ways in our community, including as chair of the Carroll County Human Relations Commission. She's a founding member of CCRE, so she's been dedicated to this work of CCRE for 28 years. So Virginia Harrison, I thank you for all that you do and for sharing some background information about Carroll Citizens for Racial Equality. I'll leave it to you, Virginia.
Thank you. Thank you, and good morning. I'm going to give you a little history about Carroll Citizens for Racial Equality and how we got started. Back in 1992, I had just become the chairperson of the Human Relations Commission, and we weren't doing much. And then I got a call from a group of ministers that asked me to attend their meeting. So I went to the meeting, and the meeting was that one of the young ministers there was coming home one night, and the KKK stopped him and gave him some literature. So he got a group of ministers together in Carroll County, and they invited myself and Gary Hahnemann and to talk about the racial issues in Carroll County and what should we do about this. So we chatted and had a meeting, and we had a second meeting. And by the second meeting, we were Carroll Citizens for Racial Equality. And what we wanted to do was to help our community overcome some of the racial issues that were going on in the county. And so what we felt like we could help in so many ways. So we wanted to give the community a place to go or someone to reach out to when there was a racial issue. And one thing that happened that I thought was very interesting, we had a lady who they burned a cross on her lawn. And we met with her and talked to her, and she was afraid, was very fearful of what happened. So we had a community meeting to talk about it. And it was very interesting that that day we had the Grand Dragon of the Klan to stop in to our meeting. And when he spoke, he was very upset because we should have known that if they burn a cross, it's wrapped a certain way, and this cross was not, and we were just picking on them. And later we found out it was the lady's neighbor. He had some issues, and he was the one that burned the cross on her lawn. And actually, about 15 years after that, I got a call from Human Services saying that there was a lady in there. She was very ill, and somebody had burned a cross on her lawn years and years ago, and she never knew who it was, and she was trying to find out. And we were able to talk to her and let her reassure her that it was her neighbor. And so one of the other things we did, we wanted to sort of educate our community in some way and let the community know that we were available. And one of the things that we came up with, we started to do a newsletter, and this was our first newsletter, and it's called Bridging the Gap. And as you can see, it was just a fold up with you open it up and it was 4 pages. But we also at one time I got a call from a parent that there was a racial incident at South Carroll High School. And the parent was very upset, and the parent's child didn't want them to say anything. So he asked me if I would go talk to the school. So I made a call to the school system, and I said to him, I said, okay, my name is Virginia Harrison, and I'm from the Human Relations Commission, and this is what I heard that's going on in the community. I want to hear from you what really happened. So we talked about that, and we decided that we wanted to do something with the kids to talk about race. So we decided to put on a leadership conference. And out of that, we took 120 kids from that school to New Windsor Service Center so that we could have the conference. And the kids that we picked, they were leaders, but not necessarily academic leaders, but leaders in their school. And surprising to me, I really didn't think this was a really big deal. But the day that we got to New Windsor, the television station was there, the superintendent was there, somebody was there from the state of Maryland. But it turned out to be a really, really successful day because we broke it up into 4 different sections, and we had the kids to talk about race. And I think I got more out of that day than they did. But it turned out to be an awesome day. And Gary and I, we were always a team. And when the day was over, we looked at each other like, wow, this is amazing. But out of that came a multicultural education program with the school system, and that we started so that they could work on the projects in the school. And when they did, we would put them in our newsletter, And we decided we would pick out some areas in our community. If something was going on, that we would chat about it. And we had the NAACP came, and we had the Multicultural Leadership Conference, and we would put, this is our group that we had, and every year we would do that. And we thought working with the middle school was better because whatever they learned, they could carry it on in this to high school. And also, we in our newsletter, we pick a book every year about the subject that we so we can keep the community engaged. And we work very closely with the school system, because when Martin Luther King Day came, we did it as not a day off, but a day on, and we would meet with the students and have some type of different program, because we're all about networking and bringing in the community. And then once a year, we would get together with all the groups in our community that was working on discrimination to come together, such as the Human Relations, Carroll Citizens, Racial Equality, Common Ground on the Hill, a lot of groups, so we could know that we're all on the same page and we pretty much work together as a community. And some of the targets, things we would talk about is whatever was going on. When there was a lot of discrimination about Muslim, we had a program called Muslim in Our Community. And one of the guest speakers was Dr. Muhammad Esau from McDaniel College. We had another program another year that talked about embracing our LGBT community. And we had one about what's this talk about privilege. And it's an amazing how many people come out, and we've been doing this for 20 years. And we have one of these conferences, and the community would say, "We never knew you existed. We've never heard of you. We really don't know." And I think what we've been doing sort of leads us into what's going on now. And it helps make things a little easier for us now, because this is some difficult times. And so I think it's the end of my time, and I would like to introduce our next guest, who is Pam Zappadino. Thank you.
Thank you, Virginia. My job here as part of the CCRE steering committee is to go over the logistics for today. We would like to ask you to keep your Zoom on mute so that we don't hear background noise that's coming in from your location. You never know when a fire truck is going to go down your street. So if you could stay on mute. Also feel free to turn off your camera. It may be less distracting for folks if they're trying to focus on the main speaker. Also, we would ask that you use the chat for asking questions of our speaker, Dr. Denise Brown. She will have a question and answer period at the end, and I will relay your questions to her. That way we can make sure that we get as many in as possible. We do have someone monitoring the participants. So those of you who are signed up for CEUs will be checked on that list, so you don't have to worry that you haven't gotten checked in. Also, for those who are earning CEUs this morning, Gary Hahnemann will, see, that's why you should stay muted. Gary Hahnemann will give you details about how that process will work from this point on at the end of our conference this morning. So don't bolt right after the questions and answers, because Gary has some important information for you. Let's see. Talked about muting in video, talked about chat, using the chat for question and answers, and the CEU information. Does anyone have any questions at this point concerning logistics? You can unmute to ask me a question if you have one. Hearing none, I'm assuming we have no logistics questions. Again, make sure, oh, one other thing. If you don't want to look at the whole array of people or names for those who have blocked their video, somewhere on your device screen, you should be able to click speaker view. And if you click speaker view, then you will see in a large area just the person who is speaking, and you'll see tiny thumbnails of the other people. So especially for when Dr. Brown is speaking, you might want to move to speaker view so the rest of us aren't serving as a distraction. Okay. Any questions? This is your last chance. Okay. Then my job is to say thank you so much for being here. Right now we have 161 people here, which is a new record, and I see more people are coming in. So we're really grateful that you're spending your morning with us. And I'm going to turn it over now to Gary Hahnemann.
Thanks, Pam. Good morning, everyone. So this past week, it's been a really busy month getting ready for today. But in the last week or two, I've gotten some pretty special emails from people who have told me that they're going to bring their children and their grandchildren here today. And I think about the movement that's happening now. Years ago, David Halberstam wrote a book called The Children Shall Lead. And here we are again today with the Black Lives Matter movement, and the young people are leading us. So one of the benefits of this virtual experience today is that moms and dads and kids can have this experience together. School isn't in session today, but I'm going to suggest that your kids can get into some good trouble today, right? There's enough bad trouble out there in the world for kids to get into. Lots of it. But Congressman Lewis reminded us before he passed, and for years. And he was one of those children early on that led the way. And he talked to us about good trouble. So I hope the young people that are watching today can get into some good trouble for all of us. And that leads me to introduce Dr. Brown, because she knows a lot about educating and mentoring and leading young people. And over the recent years that I've known her, I've gotten to know the Towson University students that have benefited from her mentoring and modeling. And the training and education that she provides. So with that as a backdrop, let me just tell you that Dr. Brown is originally from Niagara Falls, New York. She received her PhD in counseling psychology from Ohio State University in 2008. She is currently an associate professor in the counseling psychology graduate program at Towson University. She also serves as the coordinator of clinical training for that program, as I suggested. Her research covers African American resiliency, racial socialization, and the intersectional experiences of Black women. Her most recent publication focused on critical issues related to Black women's identities and provided suggestions for incorporating intersectional pedagogy around Black women's mental health in clinical training. In addition to her work in academia, Dr. Brown is a licensed psychologist with a private practice. So without further ado, let me turn things over to Dr. Brown.
Thanks, Gary. I'm just gonna go ahead and share my screen and get started here. And I just wanna do a quick check and make sure everyone can hear me. Gary, can you let me know that? Can you give me a thumbs up, Gary, that you can hear me? All right, perfect. Good morning, all. So here we are to continue in the practice of physical distancing, but with an opportunity for social connection. And so today I'm here to talk to you all about racial justice and the process of moving from othering to really sort of taking in anti-racist action. So I thought we could sort of start today by giving you a chance to sort of quietly think to yourselves the answers to some questions. So I want you to think about the last time you had a conversation about race. And you might also be thinking about how that went right now. I also want you to think about how often you think about your own race. And then finally, I wonder if you can remember any family or neighborhood discussions about the topic of race. And so I want you to think about that for a minute, right? Sort of family conversations about race. And maybe at this time, you might be thinking, I don't really remember having conversations in my family or in my neighborhood about race. But what I want you to hopefully take in is that even conversations that don't happen about race convey some message about race. And we're gonna sort of come back to that hopefully a little bit later. See, as I come to you today, and I know my mom is out there watching, and I think about my own experiences in terms of talks with my family and my parents about race, I have to be honest with you, I don't think that I originally thought or knew that they were about race as a kid. I can remember sitting across from my dad and him looking over at me and looking me square in the eye and saying, no matter what anybody says, you are smart. Don't let anybody tell you anything different. Don't let anybody tell you that you are less than or not as smart as them. And me being the kid that I am, well, my first thought was, duh, of course I'm smart. Did you see me count those forks over there? Amazing. And I can recall sitting on my grandmother's patio with my mom, and I'll never forget, the sun was shining on us, and she looked over at me, and she said, your brown skin is so beautiful. Don't forget how beautiful your brown skin is. And so at the time, all I could think is, my parents think I'm amazing. Okay, this is a good place to be. But what I didn't realize at the time were the various ways in which my parents were actually trying to prepare me for a world that intended to other me. See, what my parents and other adults in my life knew is that I was going to be stepping out into a world that had already been defined into us and them. And I belong to a group of them. And belonging in that group of them sort of had already put me in this place in which folks who didn't even know me would attribute some type of negative idea to me, would think that I wasn't smart, would think that I wasn't beautiful. And in the most dangerous cases, would assume that I was a threat. See, what my parents and family and adults in my community knew is that I was stepping into a world that wasn't just engaging in sort of this benign idea of othering, right? Because when we think of othering, we think of, I like one team, you like another team. We're on opposite sides of the living room during the football game. But they knew that I was actually stepping into a more dangerous form of othering, a form of othering that was actually attributed to my own racial identity, a form of othering that had decided that folks who identify as Black, Indigenous, and people of color were seen as the opposite of whiteness and white folks who were somehow viewed as normal and, whether true or not, superior. And that was a dangerous thing for me to be stepping into. That was the danger that my parents were aware of, that when I was a child, I was not. But I soon came to learn. Because see, what I learned as an adult, what I continue to learn as an adult, is how dangerous racial othering can be. How it allows folks to engage in this process of devaluing and denying the experiences of Black, Indigenous, people of color. And in its most dangerous, most insidious form, allows folks to deny the dignity and humanity of Black folks and brown folks. But here's the thing that I hope we can also begin to have conversations about. And that is that othering does not serve anyone. Because you see, in order to deny the dignity and humanity of another person, you kind of have to give up a little bit of your own humanity. And so in many ways, this process is a disservice to all of us. And yet, as I prepared for this presentation and reflected on Toni Morrison's Origins of Othering, I sort of came back to this line that sort of sticks out to me. And if you read the book, this might be a line that you easily pass over. But for me, I kind of kept coming back to it. When she asked the question, what is the nature of othering's comfort, of its allure, of its power? And it's that last word that sort of really sticks out for me. This idea of power, right? Because two people who dislike each other are just two people who dislike each other. But when you have this sense of othering someone, identifying that they don't belong, and that is reinforced by a system of power that backs up these ideas that you have about this other, that is the crux of racism. And that is what racism is. It is not just a dislike of another person. It is a dislike that gets reinforced by systems of power, like the criminal justice system. And it allows folks to weaponize their voices by simply uttering the words threat, that this other is threatening. And it completely changes the dynamics. You see, when folks like Amy Cooper pick up their phone to make that call, and they make sure that they indicate that this other, this Black person, this brown person is a threat, they are in fact weaponizing their voices. And they are in fact reinforcing their racial othering and feeling supported and validated in their racial othering by these systems of power. And so when I teach courses on multicultural psych and we get to these conversations about race and racism, I often have students say things like, well, if we could just be nicer to each other, if we could just be kinder to each other, maybe then we can start to understand and work through things. And that's not a bad idea. Being kind and nice to each other, that's great. But that is not going to get to the true core and center of the racism that has infiltrated every system in this country. Because you see, racism is systemic, and anyone who is not willing to engage in a conversation about the systemic nature of racism is trying to cut out very important parts that contribute to the continuation of racial injustice. You see, when we have institutions that have policies and practices and laws that support racial othering and support racist beliefs, when we have structures that continue to create barriers, racial barriers for Black and brown folks, in many ways limiting their access to the very important aspects of American life, like wealth and employment and housing, education, healthcare. We have gone well past just being nice to one another. And the thing is, all of these things flow together, because when we have policies and practices, for example, that allow a student to be denied the ability to walk across a graduation stage because of the dreadlocks in his hair, what it does is it supports that individual's idea of racial othering. And it leads to this internalization of it for everyone. Internalized ideas that I am validated in my racial othering, and internalized ideas that I am othered. And this is where our conversation needs to happen. And this is where the conversation and the move towards racial justice needs to start. Not with a conversation about how we are nice and kind to one another, but how we actually do something to impact and change the structures and institutions that have continued to create gaps and disproportionate experiences for Black and brown folks for centuries. And here's the thing, it is not just that we need to talk about these institutions, but we also need to find some way to incorporate a larger discussion just about the overall experiences that Black and brown folks are having. Because you see, on any given day, when I'm walking my dog in my neighborhood, I might be followed by the police to my front door, as if my dog and I maybe fit the description of someone. I don't know, someone's walking around with a fluffy dog, looking in windows. That might be me, or it might not. So I have to deal with that. But in addition to that, then I also just have to deal with all of the other racial microaggressions that might happen. See, when we weren't in a pandemic and I was going to work, I would also then have to deal with hearing the jokes that people make, right? The jokes that folks make about Black and brown folks, the jokes that my students hear people make about Black and brown folks, the questions of whether Black and brown folks are actually intelligent, the questions of whether we actually, have communities and have families and have fathers, all of these things that just get thrown on top of me having to just deal with the police and having to deal with the security guard who follows me in the store, and me having to deal with the ongoing barrage of news about families who are pulled over when someone has the wrong tag number. And I have to now reflect on this image this week of a little girl in a pink queen crown with her face on the ground in a parking lot. These are all the things that sort of build up for Black and brown folks. And if you don't listen to that, if you don't know about that, you can't account for how frustrating and powerless it can really feel. But then here is the reality, because not only do we have to deal with all of these just various instances of individual, interpersonal, institutional, and structural racism, we still have to get up and go to work and take care of our families and survive a pandemic. And so we have to try to find ways to reallocate cognitive and emotional and psychological resources to be able to do that. And that can be exhausting and can lead to racial battle fatigue. Just this constant reallocation of resources to trying to cope with all of these various things that we're being hit with that are race related, in addition to just thinking about getting up and getting your kids ready for school, or getting up and thinking about what you need to accomplish for the day. And that can lead to so much anger and resentment, sickness, and just this desire to socially withdraw. You see, when this pandemic hit, while it was devastating for a lot of folks to be in the house, I can remember right as it was hitting, having conversations with friends and other colleagues of color about how now they at least didn't have to go into the office and interact with folks who questioned them and interact with folks who made jokes. At least now they just had to do it on a Zoom meeting that they could log out of, or a Zoom meeting that they could check out on. And so when you have that experience, right, of just constant race-related stress leading to racial battle fatigue, you shouldn't be surprised then when Black and brown folks are sitting back and asking themselves, where is the justice? Where is the justice that is promised to citizens of this country, but somehow seems to be missed for Black and brown folks here? And this is just sort of compounded by the reality of the names of Black and brown folks who are murdered yearly as a result of police brutality and police violence. Names that just continually get added to the list, and the marches that happen and the protests that happen. Again, where is the justice for all that we were promised? And this is only magnified for Black women, other women of color, and Black trans folks. The idea that as these conversations around police brutality often don't include us, or don't include conversations about interactions that Black women and Black trans folks are also having with police. And so when we call out the name of Breonna Taylor, we also need to be calling out the name of Tony McDade, Atiana Jefferson, Rakia Boyd, Ayanna Jones. And if those last few names are unfamiliar to you, I encourage you to take a minute to reflect on what I just said. All of this together contributes to various instances of just racial trauma. See, it is not just that Black folks are the victims of racial discrimination and racial oppression. Even when it does not personally happen to us, we are continually subjected to it. See, social media is great, but in so many ways, social media can be so dangerous, because even on the days when I am just trying to shut it out and not have to see Black and brown bodies lying on the ground, the videos and the images that are shared and reshared just keep happening. And there I am, re-traumatized again, just trying to find a way to cope and reallocating resources to doing that. And we have to have a discussion about racial trauma, because in so many ways, racial trauma is very similar to the symptoms that we see with PTSD. As a clinician, I am constantly working with Black folks and listening for these symptoms of anxiety and paranoia and nightmares, feeling helpless, somatic complaints, just increased sickness and elevated blood pressure. All of these things that as clinicians we may be aware of as related to PTSD, but are also related to experiences of racial trauma that Black and brown folks may be dealing with. And as I sit here talking about this, I realize, even just sort of this last point that I have to make, that studies have shown that racial trauma is intergenerational. Because you see, when I reflect on the messages that my parents gave me when I was younger, while I could only sort of see them as things that were sort of communicated to me, talking about how amazing and awesome I was as a kid, as an adult, and I think back to those messages, I realize how much they came from a place of pain. From a place of realizing the pain that I might experience, the pain that they had experienced, the pain that my grandparents had experienced. And I sit back and I realize the pain that kids today, our youth today, even as they march in the streets, are experiencing. And I recognize that it's not just that I'm awesome. And don't get me wrong, with my mom out there, I know I'm awesome. But I am also, in so many ways, traumatized by the things that I have no choice but to deal with. And so here we are sitting in two pandemics, right? And oftentimes, you hear folks say this idea that we're dealing with dual pandemics, right? Or double pandemics. And when I hear folks talking about these conversations, even as I'm taking my dog for a walk in the park, I hear them sort of describe it as, the one pandemic being COVID and the other pandemic being, all of the racial tension that is existing. But I want to clarify something. One pandemic is COVID, but the other pandemic is not the racial tension. The other pandemic is racism that has been a virus in our country for years, a virus that has infected so many, and a virus that has in many ways limited the freedom, liberty, rights, and justice that Black and brown folks deserve. And so when we talk about existing in a dual pandemic, and dual pandemics or double pandemics, that is really what we are talking about. The fact that we are in this, first or second wave of COVID, I'm not quite sure, but we are potentially in the millionth wave of racism and institutional racism and structural racism that continues to create inequality and inequity for Black and brown folks. And these two waves are clashing. They are clashing in the worst way as Black communities are more severely impacted, and not severely impacted because they are Black communities, but as a result of the systemic racism that has resulted in impoverished Black neighborhoods, the systemic racism that has contributed to poor treatment in healthcare, the race-related stress that leads to increased and elevated blood pressure, increased sickness, decrease in our ability to fight off sickness. All of these things are what is contributing to this dual pandemic. And if that is not enough, the very things that would keep us safe and sane during this pandemic are not easily and readily available for Black and brown folks. Because see, even as Black folks walk through the stores and walk through their neighborhoods with masks, they have to question if they are safe. Because a Black person walking through a college campus, through a neighborhood, through a store with a mask on, apparently is still considered a threat. I say this even as I reflect on a time when my husband and I were driving in a car to a friend's outside backyard. And we were talking about, when is it safe to put your mask on and take your mask off? And he put his mask on as we were driving through this suburban neighborhood. And we were laughing about it until we got to a stop sign. And as we got to the stop sign, I noticed two women who were out, and they looked in the car and they were sort of just staring. And instantly I sort of panicked and I told him, take it off, take it off. And he said, what's wrong? And I said, no, we are in the suburbs. We're driving in a car. It's just the two of us. Take your mask off. And so the fact that we even had to think about that suddenly that sent me into this sense of panic. That is not something that everyone has to consider. And so there's this reality that even as we are all trying to cope with COVID and find ways to connect socially and find ways to get out and hike and take walks, that this is not something that can easily always come for Black and brown folks, as we still have to contemplate, will I be perceived as a threat as I'm trying to just cope with this like everyone else? And what this says is we are not all in the same boat. We may be all in the same storm, but we are definitely not all in the same boat when it comes to this pandemic. And so as we struggle with these dual pandemics, and as things started to unfold in March and April with the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, this resistance started to pick up again. And I often hear the news talking about, the murder of George Floyd as sort of being this sort of thing that set it off. But honestly, you can only believe that if you ignore the racial uprising in Ferguson and the racial uprising very close in Baltimore City, where I currently live, that set the stage for the current racial uprising and resistance that we see now against anti-Black racism. And the truth is, while some are surprised, I am not. Because what can you expect when you have folks who are grieving, when you have Black communities who are grieving the loss of life that isn't deserved. And even as we attempt to grieve the loss of this life, we're not even afforded that opportunity, because it is not long before we were able to grieve the loss of George Floyd and grieve the loss of Breonna Taylor, that suddenly the victim blaming came in. And there are questions about what they did and who they were affiliated that would have contributed to what happened to them. But here's the thing, folks. I could be wrong, but last time I checked, regardless of what you did in this country, it is a right to be tried by a jury of your peers. But these folks were executed in the street and in their beds, and folks have been executed in their backyards and on their grandmother's couches. And so how can we expect anything but a sense of collective grief for the repeated and exposed injustice that just continues to happen for Black communities? How can we not expect anger and rage as folks are being told not just that you're not allowed to grieve because this was a bad person, but also here is the right way to grieve. Imagine experiencing loss and being told this is the right way to grieve. And so here we are in another racial uprising and another wave of resistance and another cry for Black lives and another fight against anti-Black racism. But this time it feels different. In so many ways, it feels different. Because as I listen to this generation march in the streets and declare that we are no longer going to be othered, to engage in this process of de-othering in which we are saying that being Black is not the problem, the racially oppressive system that continues racial injustice is, that is an amazing and beautiful thing. To see folks cry out for their own liberation, to be able to engage in this form of psychological and political well-being and resist the oppressive forces that have continued to contribute to the racial trauma that my generation has experienced and my parents' generation has experienced is amazing. Because for someone who studies African American resiliency and Black mental health, this for me is seen as a form of radical healing, of an opportunity for folks to engage in a process of becoming whole in spite of being subjected to constant racial related stress and racial trauma. It is a moment of development of critical consciousness for a lot of folks, of being able to name what is happening to Black communities, to name what is happening to Black trans folks, Black women, Black folks across this country, and to be able to do so as our authentic selves, as my authentic self, which creates this sense of radical hope of being able to envision a world that truly does offer freedom and liberty and dignity and justice for Black and brown communities. To be able to support one another and receive support so that we can cultivate the necessary coping skills to continue to resist and be strong. And that piece, that is very important. All of this here, this is what contributes to resiliency. Resiliency is not just taking what is given to you and just sitting with it. Resiliency is being able to name it, to talk about its impact, to ask for support, and to resist. And so as I witness these demonstrations and examples of Black joy and Black resilience, this is where we need to be. And that is an opportunity for me to exhale. But here's the thing. I don't see this as just a fight for Black and brown communities. This is everyone's fight. Because when we tolerate injustice, we are complicit in it, and we are complicit in its danger and its harm. And so this is an opportunity to welcome and awaken new allies and to welcome back older allies who maybe are looking to sort of refresh themselves and re-examine how they've been allies. So we have a long journey to take, but we have to be willing to take this together because, again, as I often tell my students, combating racism and racial injustice is not just about being nice to each other. We have tried that. That does not work. In a society in which racism is allowed to infiltrate every aspect of American life and push folks to the margins of the most important aspects of American life, we must be anti-racist. And so I hope that some of the things that I have mentioned already have got you reignited or excited, and you were thinking about ways that you can also start to engage in anti-racist action and behavior. But before we do that, I encourage you to take a minute to think about where you are starting from, because this is really important. When I talk with folks about anti-racist actions and anti-racist behaviors, and they're ready to dive in and start with the most complicated text, and then they don't get it, and then they get frustrated, and then they shut down, that is because you haven't actually sat back and asked yourself the question, where am I? Where am I starting from? How have I just begun to examine my own racial identity? What happens in those conversations that I have about race? And do I actually engage in those conversations about race? Knowing where you are starting from is the perfect place to figure out where you need to go. Because for where we are right now, there is no room for anything but authentic allyship, for folks who can have a commitment to anti-racist action, who can hold themselves accountable and are willing to examine their own privilege, who are not just doing it for the gram and for social media, who can sit with that very real discomfort that will come with examining your own biases and prejudice, and who can be just as upset and grieved and outraged as I am and other Black folks are and other brown folks are by what is happening in our society, what is happening in our country. Because there is no space for the performative allyship that we have seen of the past. Sitting here thinking about when things happened in March and April, and you had all of these companies who were talking about Black Lives Matter, and they changed their ads and changed their slogans. And there were all these sort of campaigns to put up this black block, and then put up this black block that says Black Lives Matters. And as I look back at social media and the ads, and I realize that they are all gone now. They're gone now, but the fight is continuing. So we need to be able to move past these performative things, past these hollow statements, past the white fragility that may cause you in conversations of race to shut down and use tears to stop the conversation, or become angry and stonewall to stop the conversation, as opposed to being willing to engage and sit with that discomfort and really see what it feels like. Those conversations that need to happen that don't involve suddenly centering on you and your experiences and the problematic grandparent that you have, but can really sort of get you to reflect on what are your own issues, what are your own biases, what is your own level of awareness. And completely moving beyond these videos and posts and TikToks that pretend to be examples of allyship, but are they really? See, in order to engage in true anti-racist work, you must start with yourself. You have to educate yourself about issues of whiteness and systemic racism, not just interpersonal racism. You have to think about how you can grow through that discomfort. And I'll be honest with you, I am so excited for the over 100 folks who have showed up today, but this is just a 101. There is still more work to be done. And so I encourage you, after you leave here today, to keep doing that work for yourself, to really take the time to listen. And I cannot say this strongly enough, but listen to actually just take in what Black and brown folks are saying, as opposed to listening to come up with your rebuttal or trying to find a way to explain why what I'm experiencing isn't real. Listen and validate our experiences. And really think about your own cultural humility, right? If we are talking about engaging in conversations where you have to put your pride and your ego aside, we really are talking about you engaging in conversations that allow you to exemplify some sense of humility. And cultural humility is something that has been talked about in the psychological literature and is making its way to other areas. But what it really sort of at the heart hones in on is the fact that working on issues of race and culture is a lifelong journey. It is not, you take a few classes, you sit in this workshop, and suddenly you're done, you got it, you can move on. No, it is a lifelong process of evaluating yourself and critiquing yourself and sitting in those moments of discomfort and asking yourself the question, did I just respond in a way that was biased? Did I just respond in a way that in fact was racist? It is about trying to find ways to fix these power imbalances that exist in your jobs and your neighborhoods that are very real and impact the lives of Black and Brown folks. And it is about building partnerships with folks who have been in these communities doing this work for years. Trust me, if you are interested in being involved in racial justice, you will be able to find an organization, a community member who is doing this work. This conference is being hosted by just some of those folks. And so it's about being able to partner with those folks and working towards racial justice. And when you are done educating yourself, then I encourage you to work on your community and within your community. This is the perfect time for you to work on that problematic family member and friend who manages to find a way to disrupt your holiday table every year. It is very possible to call out racist behavior while calling in someone to engage in a conversation about that behavior. And so I encourage you to do that. Talk with your children. I hear that there are kids here, and I am so excited about that. This is the perfect opportunity to leave this time today and talk with your kids about issues of race and racial othering and really answer their questions. Because as I mentioned before, not answering their questions about race provides them with some answer about race in terms of how taboo it is to talk about or how we should avoid it. And that sets the stage for them to then get to my classroom as college freshmen and sophomore and juniors and going, why didn't anyone tell us that all of this was happening? You want to address their racial othering. And this, again, is not something that has to be punitive. This creates an opportunity for you to have discussions about race and discussions about similarities and differences between folks in different racial backgrounds. It creates an opportunity for growth for them and growth for you. But when you avoid those conversations about race or you engage in colorblind responses, saying we're all the same, no one is different, you're not truly preparing them for the realities of the world, that we are different, that racial injustice exists, and that there are folks who are not having the same experience as you. And when you have educated yourself and your family and your friends, take it out to your neighborhood. Take it out to your neighborhood group. And I have been in some of those neighborhood groups on Facebook and on those apps. Trust me, these conversations are needed. Take it to your place of work because the efforts towards racial justice cannot just sort of end with you. And the truth is, they can't really just end with your communities and your family either. Because once you do that, action is so important. And so, as Gary mentioned, the unfortunate passing of Congressman John Lewis was such a severe loss for our country. But he has left us with a charge to get into some good trouble, some necessary trouble. And so I invite you to do that, to vote. This is extremely important. Voting not just locally, but nationally. Vote. We have opportunities to create and move towards structural change. Vote. To donate to organizations supporting racial justice, because let's be honest. Nothing shows that you are investing in something like you putting in your time and your money. And there are a lot of great organizations out there that are doing this work and could benefit from financial support, like the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and Showing Up for Racial Justice. There are all kinds of bail funds that exist for each state. Can you put your money where your mouth is? Working to decolonize your work. And when I say this, sometimes folks go, well, what does that mean? And I'm going to simplify it for you because I realize that I don't have a lot of time. Part of that is decentering whiteness and white values, recognizing that in your place of work, that there is an opportunity to incorporate theories and ideas and the expertise of folks of color. That we are more than willing to contribute to these conversations when you tell us that there is a seat at the table. When you recognize that some folks may have to step away from the table so that there can be more seats for people of color at this table. Because I am tired of trying to create a new table or tired of trying to find space at the table. It is time that we acknowledge that some folks may have to move so that more folks of color can have those seats at the table. And then finally, just engaging in activism and advocacy. This generation, my generation, the generation that is coming after me is doing so much. And as I mentioned, it is beautiful. It is wonderful. But there are levels to this, right? So we need folks who are going to write the letters and send the emails. And we need the folks who are going to march. And we need the folks who are going to organize. And we need the folks who are going to use their scholarship to inform folks about the racial injustice that continues to infiltrate our country. So maybe you find your level and you work with that. Because I don't want you to get overwhelmed. Just as we are talking about activism and advocacy, I want to encourage you to eat lunch and laugh with your kids and take a hike and get rested. Because honestly, we have a long path to racial justice. And so we need you rested, rejuvenated, and ready to go. Because on this path to racial justice, I believe that there are so many opportunities for us to truly be a country that is engaging in racial healing. Thank you. I guess I'm kicking it back over to Pam.
And there I am. Thank you so much, Dr. Brown. That was absolutely wonderful. And we have gotten so many questions. We probably won't get to all of these, but I'm going to try to take them in the order that they came. First off, you should know that just in the chat, I am getting comments of thank you for sharing your experience, and that your information and slides have been incredibly helpful. So you're making your points. The first question we got said, can you comment on the intersection of these negative health impacts that you mentioned and the disparities in access to wellness resources, healthcare, and insurance?
Woo!
That could take 2 days, but
that could take an entire semester. I mean, if I can simplify but not simplify, the reality is that access to good healthcare is not available for all, and really access to healthcare is based on having a job that provides you with quality healthcare. And what we find is that there are a lot of Black and brown folks who are in positions who are employed as essential workers in these jobs that don't supply quality health care. And so that limits their access to resources, that limits their access to getting regular checkups that don't cost them just astounding fee. Even when I think about my own work as a psychologist, and I take all kinds of insurance. But when I look at the deductibles that some folks have, just to be able to talk with a clinician, and that sort of serves as a deterrent for them, because I can't go see a therapist if I'm just going to end up having to pay, $200 out of pocket anyway because of my deductible. And so all of these things sort of factor in together. Also, just the consideration of the very real mistrust that exists for Black and Brown folks with healthcare providers, because healthcare providers have just not had a good history of providing quality care and allowing their biases to be put to the side in their work with Black and Brown folks. And so there are so many things that factor into that that are related to issues in employment, related to issues in how folks are treated in healthcare, related to even sort of when we talk about these intersectional issues, right? When we look at the Black maternal mortality rates and the things that contribute to that, just how willing doctors are to consider that contrary to what folks believe, Black women are not just all super strong and can take any amount of pain. That when a Black woman is in pain and she is saying to her doctor that something doesn't feel right, and that is ignored. And we've seen that just among regular folks in the Black community, but even folks like Serena Williams have talked about how their cries for, something is wrong, something doesn't feel right to their doctor. It's sort of just hushed because Black women can do anything and take it all. All of these things factor into the issues that contribute to just the poor treatment and poor access that Black and Brown communities have to healthcare. I think I answered that, but that was like my shorthand answer of it.
Well, we have plenty. Actually, we have more time than I thought we had, so don't feel the need to rush through.
Oh no, I know I started a little earlier, so I'm good.
Right. Let's see. Someone said, Dr. Brown, as a woman of color in this community, I have experienced a range of emotions from feeling like enough is enough, to hopefulness, to discouragement, afraid that things will calm down and no real change will happen. Looking back in our history, from Reconstruction to civil rights to where we are today, it has seemed that Americans, whether white, Black, or brown, get tired, and we see an almost recoil of progress. How do we maintain progress and keep moving forward? How do we keep from getting tired?
Oh, that is an excellent question. So part of it is acknowledging the fact that we are getting tired. For all of the moments that we talk about resisting, rest is also important. And oftentimes what I say to other Black women, other folks of color, is rest is also a part of resistance. Rest is a form of resistance. And so it is necessary to rest. It's important to check in on each other. It's important to think about how we can engage in healing in our communities and with our allies, to just sort of take a minute to enjoy that aspect of thinking about this as a marathon, and recognizing that in marathons, folks stop, they get a drink of water, some days they walk, sometimes they rest, they talk to folks, they hug, they ask for support. And that's really what's going to move this along, is recognizing that there are so many things that factor into this move towards racial justice. And we have to account for moments of rest and support from one another as well. And here's the other piece too, is that support piece is so important, because when you feel like you're the only one in your community and your office who is working towards this, that is definitely going to contribute to your burnout. And so the more that we have allies who are working towards this, the more that we have Black and Brown communities that are coming together to work to address these issues, the more we can sort of share some of that burden and check in on each other. I check in on my Black and Brown friends, and they check in on me. And that check-in is so important, so that I can get up the next day and do what I need to do. So that I can get up the next day and give a presentation like this, knowing that I have other presentations along this same topic next week. Yeah.
Wow, that was a good question. Let's see. Whoops, my slide just disappeared. Where is it? There it is. Let's see. Regarding racial healing, is that societal healing, personal healing, healing for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, healing for white folks, all of the above. Interestingly, as a Black woman, I find that those in my family who are doing the best mentally are those who choose to not pay attention and not be aware of what's going on in the world. That is, ignorance is bliss. That's a problem in and of itself, but still.
So I feel like there are multiple parts, multiple parts
Yes.
to that question. So the first answer is when I talk about racial healing, yeah, I do mean that there is a possibility for universal racial healing for Black folks, for Indigenous folks, for people of color to heal within ourselves, to heal within our communities, but also to engage in healing conversations with white folks. And for white folks to engage in a process of racial healing, because here's the thing, white folks do belong to a racial category and thus need to consider how they might also need to engage in some racial healing and checking in and recognizing that they don't need to other folks in order to have their place here. So when I talk about racial healing, I am talking about a process by which we as a country as a whole can actually engage in that. To the second part of ignorance is bliss, bliss can be fleeting. And so even though they may not be talking about those experiences of racism and racial discrimination, that doesn't mean that they aren't impacted by it. And in some ways, they may not even just be recognizing the impact that it has on them. If I'm honest, there have been times in my life where I have been like, no, I can remember starting out thinking, no, I just need to do my job. I just need to show up to this office. I need to present these lectures. I need to teach these students. And when things would happen to me, I would go, no, I just need to show up and do my job and just make it through the day. And then I actually had to sit back and ask myself why the same job that other folks were doing, that my white colleagues were doing, they'd have the energy to go to happy hours and have conversations afterwards. And I just felt drained and exhausted. And it was because I wasn't recognizing, or at the time, I was really trying to push out the reality that it was so much more than just going and doing my job. It was also doing my job and interacting, for example, with students who would come up and tell me I was the first Black person that they had ever talked to, and all of the ideas that they had about Black folks, and that they thought that it was a good idea to share those ideas with me. So I would say ignorance is bliss, but that bliss is fleeting.
Thank you. When moving to the learning zone, we need examples of some racist policies that are out there that could be fixed. What policies are important to address this year?
What policies are important to address this year? Honestly, I think that there are various things that can be addressed with regards to education. So let's just start there, right? So we are now in a place where there are a lot of schools that are moving online. And particularly in Baltimore City, if you think about like the number of police and security guards who are in schools, who are now no longer needed to be there because we are online. This is the perfect opportunity to think about how we increase students' access to school counselors and school social workers. Because the reality is that to think that students, Black and brown students who are having issues in school is just about a behavior problem, just about, they're bad kids, that's a misnomer, and that's the process of racial othering. When we actually say there might be other things that are going on, let's talk with them about how they're coping. Let's talk with them about how this problematic behavior may be a manifestation of, other things that are happening in their life. That honestly is a change that I think we can talk about, like really investing in the mental health services that we can provide for these kids who are now going to be learning online. There is a huge movement around issues of do we abolish or do we defund the police? And honestly, I'm a proponent of reform, of finding ways to reallocate funds to services that are possibly more necessary. We have been depending on the police to address every single community issue for way too long. And there are some issues that can be better addressed by a mental health clinician, by a social worker, by the creation of community programs, by the creation of access to food and employment opportunities in communities that don't need to involve the police. So those are really two big things that I think we can start to think about and address.
Okay, I've got to get back to where, oh, that was this year. Someone wanted to know, what should Black, Indigenous, and people of color be doing to help bridge the gap and work toward healing our country?
Be willing to have the conversations, but also here's the thing. When I say be willing to have the conversations, I don't mean like lay yourself out and for like folks to take advantage. I think that there's definitely work that we can be doing in our own communities, but in terms of being willing to, I'll say, service consultants as white allies are working on improving their own education around these things, I feel like I'm always willing to do that. So when I think about my own role as a Black woman and bridging the gap, I think about even like initiatives that are happening at my own job and folks that are doing the work. And then I will check in and talk with you about the work. And if we want to have a conversation about the work that's being done, I'm happy to do that. But I'm also going to make sure that I think about my own survival and my own care. So when I think about what Black and brown folks can do to bridge the gap, part of that is be willing to engage in your own self-care, because that is necessary. There is a lot of anger and pain and sadness, and that needs to be addressed. But there are moments in which there are allies who are willing to partner and organize, and there are places in which we can open those doors and allow that partnership to happen without feeling like we're being taken advantage of and used.
Dr. Brown, someone has asked if you could stop screen sharing so they can see you better.
Yes, I can do that. No problem.
Go. Okay, next question. How can we get at and uncover and eradicate implicit bias?
Wow. How can we get at, uncover, and eradicate? That is something that I would in fact need an entire course to talk about. Honestly, it's going to take steps, but we need dedication to the process. I feel like it always starts with folks being willing to engage in some honest self-awareness. And that is not something that is easily done. And I get that. No one likes to feel bad. No one likes to feel like they've done something wrong. But we need to think about how we have these conversations. What I mentioned earlier about being able to call out racist behavior while calling someone in. Guess what? We are all susceptible to engaging in some type of racial bias or racial prejudice. So let's just accept that and then be willing to sort of take a look at yourself and how those things are manifesting and be willing to have the conversation. So honestly, when I think about how do we begin to how do we sort of move towards eradicating racial bias and injustice, the work starts with us. The work actually does start with how we think about ourselves. And then once we do that self-evaluation, how willing we are to reach out and challenge these structures and challenge these policies that don't really have a legitimate place in our country if we are a country that is based on, like I said, freedom, justice, and liberty for all. So it starts with you, and then you being willing to think about how this manifests itself in your work, how it manifests itself in your neighborhood, and being willing to challenge those things as well. And not just on your own, with the support of other folks, with the support of other allies.
Thank you. Workplace question. Do you have suggestions on how to respond to employers and organizations that seem to think equality is advocacy and that advocacy goes against their neutrality?
Honestly, Pam, when you said that, my first thought was, who can be neutral in this? I honestly don't feel like neutrality is a possibility, because if you allow racist practices to continue to exist in your organization and your company, then you are in fact in line with racial injustice continuing to have a presence at your organization. For me, I see it as an ethical issue. I don't see it as an issue of, of advocacy. I see it as an issue of good business, good practice, and ethics. And when I've done presentations for organizations and corporations, I phrased it as such. Like, this is an opportunity, like, you have an opportunity to cut down on the experiences, the negative experiences that your workers of color are having, that can allow them to be more productive, first off, improve employee relations, improve relations between employer and employee. So this is not an issue of trying to be neutral or just advocacy. This is also an issue of ethics and an issue of creating a work environment that is conducive to getting stuff done.
Yeah, I'm reminded of a quote from Elie Wiesel that said, "Those who insist on remaining neutral are taking the side of the oppressor, never the oppressed."
Never, never.
Okay, a question about our schools. Our elementary, middle, and high school student leaders and allies ask, what do we do about racism at school, in the community, on social media? Your thoughts on our responses as school staff, keeping the momentum going?
School staff need to engage in their own training and education first, because the thing is, kids are there, well, though not there right now, and they're under your guidance, they're under your mentorship, they're under your leadership. And so you have to really set the stage and create the environment that says racist behavior is not tolerated here, and says that when something happens in school that is related to racial injustice, that we as a staff and we as a school community are going to address it. We're not going to push it to the side. We're not going to assign blame. We're going to engage the entire school community around it. But that can't happen if school officials have not done the work within their ranks first. And that is a really big thing, because I have seen schools that have tried to have these reconciliation and healing circles, and they themselves as a staff actually haven't addressed some of the issues that are happening among the teachers and between teachers and principals and other staff folks. And so the work has to start with you, so that you can set an example for students, so that you can create a space so that when something happens in a classroom with one teacher, that teacher is very aware that all of the other teachers are invested in addressing that issue of racial injustice, and that the school as a community is going to address it.
Thank you. What are some of the topics to bring into the workplace for productive discussions where you've seen the most success? Code switching, microaggressions, etc.
I feel like there is some space for all of them, depending on your work environment. Talking about aspects of racial microaggressions, there's so much literature out there, not just on what racial microaggressions are, but how you respond to them, how they impact work, how they impact productivity, how they can be addressed. There's so much literature out there that I feel like that is a great place to start with any corporation, any organization. And issues of like code switching actually sort of come in as you engage in these conversations around racial microaggressions. So I think talking about racial microaggressions is a good place to start, because as I reflect on Virginia, talking about, these instances in Carroll County in which folks were burning crosses on people's lawns, like, no one's burning a cross on someone's desk. But what is happening is I come in and I get ready to engage in a conversation around a topic that we're having. And I've made a suggestion, and everyone sort of skips over it until the white male in the room or the white woman in the room mentions the same exact thing that I said. And now all of a sudden everyone's like, oh, that's a great idea. So, there is an opportunity to have conversations around those exchanges, and also opportunity for coworkers to talk about how they can start to amplify the voices of folks of color. I can still remember sitting in a faculty meeting at the university I used to work at, and having a close friend, a white ally, as I made a comment about how we should move forward with addressing something related to advising. And the entire room just sort of glazes over it. And so then she makes the comment again, and they go, "Oh my gosh, that's a great comment." And her response was, "Yeah, it was actually really great when Denise first mentioned it." And then the whole room kind of turns to me, and now I realize that I have the stage. And so doing things like that and talking about how things like that can happen in your place of employment, I think are beneficial. So yeah, talking about racial microaggressions and how code switching can come into that, but also talking about just the realities of racial trauma that Black and brown folks in your organizations and in your companies might be experiencing, and how that might contribute to racial battle fatigue can be important as well.
Okay, next we have, please speak to Black on Black violence as a result of racism.
Oh, this conversation of Black on Black violence. So here's my take on Black violence. And I'll also say that for the person who asked that question, but also other folks, if you are interested, there was a recent blog that came out by a psychologist named Kevin Coakley in Psychology Today. And he actually talks about how this question of Black on Black violence continues to come up. And so one of the things that Dr. Coakley actually sort of talks about is the fact that if we're going to talk about Black on Black violence, doing so without accounting for the systemic issues that result, again, in impoverished Black communities and Black children not having access to resources and Black families not having access to resources. Just a conversation about Black on Black violence without accounting for that. Thanks, Pam, for putting that in. It's sort of really void of a move towards racial justice. Yes, Black on Black violence is a real issue. Black on Black violence is a real issue that Black communities are addressing. So even when I hear folks say that Black folks are not addressing Black on Black crimes, that's not true. Living in the city of Baltimore and thinking about all the ceasefire weekends that are coming up and all of the community leaders that are working to address violence in Black communities while also fighting racial justice and fighting the mechanisms and structural barriers that have contributed to folks feeling like they don't have enough options. That is happening. And so in thinking about this topic of Black on Black violence, I encourage you to read the blog from Dr. Coakley, but also consider how, yes, to the last part of that question, how mechanisms of racial othering and white racism and the internalization of those aspects do in fact contribute to factors that are linked to Black on Black violence. Pam, am I talking too fast? I just want to make sure.
I think you're okay, but we do have time, so and we're getting right through this. Let's see. The next question says, as a white person, I have wanted to initiate conversations with friends and coworkers of color, but I get nervous that I'm going to say something insensitive even as I'm trying to ask for help. What is the best way to initiate these conversations?
The first thing is to recognize that you might in fact say something that is offensive, or you might actually say something that is a reflection of ignorance, which we all have. But you have to be willing to still sort of stay engaged in the conversation. And if this is a conversation you are seeking to have with a friend, then the hope is that that friend will hear it, give you the feedback on that, and you're willing to sit with that feedback. These conversations about race are not easy. And honestly, because of so many things that have happened in our country, they're not really meant to be easy. They're going to be difficult. But the fact is that we can sort of move through that anxiety and move through that discomfort and continue to engage in these conversations. So the truth is, here's what I'll say. Before you engage in that conversation with that friend, do some work yourself, right? Because I can actually think of an instance in which a friend came to me, and this is an example of what I think was the right way to do it. She decided that she had questions, and she said before she even got to me, she had questions about like the dynamics and the politics of like Black hair, because I had mentioned something like the day before about my hair and whether it was going to be straight or whether it was going to be in its natural state. And so what she did was she went and she read some articles, and then she came back to me and she said, So I read this interesting article about Black women and Black hair. And so I wanted to check in with you to see if you feel like this is something that impacts your experience and how you feel like it impacts your experience. That was a conversation I was willing to have, because she didn't just come to me and say, so what's the deal with Black hair? She said she did her own work, and then she came to me, and then she didn't assume that I was like every other Black woman on this issue of Black hair. She asked me if it related to me personally, if it was related to my own personal experience. And that for me was a true friend and a true ally.
Thank you. As a person of mixed race, I understand I still have to work on educating myself about white privilege, as I have benefited from it. I also have experiences of discrimination. I don't consider myself white. Are there any articles or books you can suggest?
Yes, actually there is a book by Dr. Annalise Singh. It's called The Racial Healing Workbook. And it's a really great book that is actually perfectly designed for folks of color, for folks of multiracial descent, to sort of talk through this sort of these intersecting aspects of your racial identity. And Dr. Singh has done some great work around that. There also have been folks who have written a lot of articles on like multiracial identity development. I believe Nicole Settles has done some work. Settles has done some work. Nicole Buchanan has done some work in this area. But I would say, in terms of books, the Racial Healing Workbook that Dr. Singh just came out, I think could be pretty beneficial.
Great, thank you. I'm just typing that into the chat for folks.
That her name is not quite spelled right there.
Okay.
I believe that should be maybe an E instead of an A. I just want to make sure that her name is spelled right.
Okay, A-N-E-L-I...
Annalise Singh, yes.
Okay, A-N-E-L-I-E-S-E. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Whoops, why didn't it come up? We'll get there. There it is. Okay, back to our questions. We did that one. As educators with various age group and limited racial diversity, how do we become welcome allies and facilitators of anti-racist teaching?
Could you read that again for me, Pam?
Sure. You find it as educators with various age groups and limited racial diversity, which we do have in this county. Mm-hmm. How do we become welcome allies and facilitators of anti-racist teaching?
Partnerships. I mean, this is an opportunity for you to get out of your community and see what's out there. And like I said, while we're engaging in physical distancing but social connection, there are so many organizations out there that are willing to take in folks who are wanting to be allies, to learn about what it means to be an ally, to go through ally training. And so this is that sort of piece of cultural humility, of being willing to step outside of your community and partner with other folks who can sort of provide you with some guidance on that, and can really help you feel comfortable in your role as an ally back in your community.
Okay. Okay, then we did that one. What is the number one thing the judicial system should do to address these issues and their effect on Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities?
The number one thing?
Yes.
Oh, wow. I'll be honest, I don't think there's one thing. I think that there are multiple things, but the truth is, when we talk about reform, folks just think about police reform, but there actually needs to be reform at every single level. There needs to be reform when we talk about judges. There needs to be reform in terms of when we talk about prosecutors. Reform has to happen at every single level. When I even think about the most recent instance of the 15-year-old girl, Black girl in Michigan, in which a judge sentenced her to juvenile detention for not completing her online homework. That was a judge that made that decision. And so we need to consider how reform needs to happen at multiple levels, not just with police. And it does need to happen with police, but it also needs to happen when we talk about prosecutors and when we talk about judges as well. And I feel like that's a very sort of broad answer, because the truth is so much work needs to be done. I don't think I can identify just one thing.
Okay. Okay, we have a question about superimposing sexism on racism. It says, as a white woman, being ignored in a work meeting and having a white male say the exact same thing has happened to me often in the workplace. Having a trauma-based response to males happens due to a history of being othered by men in the workplace and in social circumstances. For example, when meeting me and my husband, a man will mostly ask my husband what he does and ignore asking me the same question.
I'm sorry, Pam, was there a question, or was that just sort of an example? It sounds like that was just sort of an example.
She's asking, how can you superimpose sexism on racism? I think she's asking about sometimes there's an intersection of the two, and sometimes it's just white on white.
Yeah. So here's the thing. She is right. There can be an intersection of the two, particularly when we're talking about the experiences of women of color. There is an intersectional gendered racism that Black women and other women of color experience, in which I too have the experience of folks will call me Miss instead of Doctor, right? Which could very much be, I guess, on some level I could think about, is very much just related to my gender, but in so many ways, I see it as related to my identity as a Black woman, not just my identity as a woman. In some ways, I would say thinking and reflecting on these experiences of sexism may provide a space for you to think about then how that is amplified for women of color, right? Even when we think about the gender wage gap, right? And you hear all these stats that say women make 77 cents for every dollar that one white male makes. But if you actually start to break it down by race, you actually find that Black women are actually making only about 62, 63 cents for every dollar that a white male makes, while white women are making 77 cents. And so there is an intersection of race and gender. And I think that there's an opportunity, particularly for white women, as they reflect on their own experiences of sexism, to think how that is compounded by issues of race for Black women, and think about opportunities to sort of use that understanding to work towards racial justice.
Okay. We're winding.
How many more questions are we taking? Okay.
They're winding down. I think we only have 2 questions left. And
all right.
I saved the comment for the end.
All right.
How do we respond to people that say, I'm fine with peaceful protests, but the violence, looting, burning, etc., just make them, in parentheses, criminals? How to get started with people stuck in the fear bubble and denying racism? Is
that part of the same question?
Yes.
Okay. My first thought is that statement is wrong. See, because what you should have a problem with is the murder and the police brutality that contributed to folks being angry and upset and exacting that rage. And so oftentimes when I have conversations with folks and they go, peaceful protesting is okay, but all of these other things are not. I mean, my first thought is, who are you to say how someone responds to grief, right? Because who am I to say how you should respond to grief? And isn't the bigger issue the fact that someone was murdered in the street, and the fact that folks didn't get an opportunity to grieve them before we went into trying to rationalize this death? That folks would actually try to rationalize this death and so many deaths. And so the truth is, I encourage that person then to take a look at themselves. Like, think about the thought that you had, that somehow it is okay that someone died, and thus in response we can protest. But if we respond in rage, well, that's really the problem. It's not. The problem is that Black and brown folks are being murdered, and that's the problem.
Thank you. Here we have a thank you so much for this presentation, Dr. Brown. My question is, do you have any suggestions on what can be done on an institutional level in a predominantly white institution where the atmosphere in senior management holds white supremacy beliefs and white fragility, which directly or indirectly affect the climate of the community, faculty, staff, and students, especially those who identify as Black, Indigenous, or people of color?
Yeah, so my first thought is then the Black and brown folks and the allies in that organization have to be willing to hold those senior officials and administrators accountable and express their discontent. And it's one thing, like I think about it, it's one thing if I, just a sole Black person, expresses concern, but it's a whole nother thing when you have an entire organization or an entire workspace essentially saying that there are problems that exist in our company, there are problems that exist in our organization, and we're just not willing to let those ride anymore. Even identifying ways in which senior leadership can go through some type of training. And there are plenty of organizations out there that provide training for senior leadership. And again, posing this as an issue of ethics and work environment and work collegiality at a way that we can continue to be productive. And that's how I tend to approach it.
Thank you. So we have one last easy question and then the comment. I have engaged in numerous very heated conversations about race with others lately. That is, others saying racism doesn't really exist in this country anymore. There is so much work that needs to be done. Any suggestions for how to have ally conversations with those people? I think the ones saying racism doesn't really exist.
Woo!
That's why I said it was so easy.
Keep having the conversation. Folks go, well, we hit them with the facts and the figures, and sometimes facts and figures work for folks. Sometimes it's really just about talking about the real impact and feelings that people have. But I argue, use all of it. Keep having the conversation, keep being willing to have the conversation, keep showing up for the conversation. I know that we exist right now in a world in which it is so easy to unfriend folks and cancel folks out. But the minute you unfriend them and cancel them, you have the opportunity to lose them. But then guess what? I don't lose them because they still show up in my email box and on my Facebook page with their comments. So stay dedicated to having those conversations and stay open to having those conversations and let them know that we're going to keep having this conversation. And when you're ready to respond to that conversation and really think about some of the things that you said, then we can keep things going. So I would say stay dedicated to it. And I know that is a lot to ask of you, whoever you are, but I do this a lot. So if we can share the burden of this together, maybe that'll make it a little bit easier for all of us.
I'm just trying. Oh, can you handle one more? I just found one that I missed.
Okay.
Do you have any recommendations for Black people of Caribbean descent who are struggling not only with systemic racism, but integrating with their fellow Black Americans?
Ooh, that, off the top, so I want to answer this question honestly. Off the top of my head, I can't think of the resources. I do have lists of things that talk about racial healing among like folks of various ethnicities within the Black community. And there actually is tons of research out there about that. But I'm going to be honest, off the top of my head, I don't have it, Pam. I apologize to that person, but if they email me, I'm happy to send them.
Great. Okay, so I think we're down to, if I missed your question, I'm sorry. I tried to keep a good watch on the chat, but for a while there, they were coming in very, very fast and furious. Here's a comment that says, that was wonderful, Dr. Brown. Your mother should be proud of you. I have hope for the future. And in fact, our last comment, which came in quite early, is no question. just please let Dr. Brown know that her little brother, Frederick, Mom Dana, and Dad Fred Jr. are indeed watching and extremely proud of her. So I wanted to make sure to pass that along from your family. I thank everyone for the wonderful questions.
Yes,
For a
thank
while,
you.
I had one question, and then right toward the end of Dr. Brown's talk, they started coming in so fast, and I was trying to copy them into a separate file so they'd be separate from the other stuff. I think I got them all, and if I didn't, I really do apologize. But you were wonderful, Dr. Brown, in handling all those questions. I know we'll probably have a few questions, but I think it speaks to how much your talk touched people and got them thinking. So I really do think that's a wonderful thing. And, so I want to convey my own thanks and the thanks of our group.
Thank you.
And just before I turn it over to Gary, I want to remind, here's one detail Gary may not be following about CEUs, so still listen to what he says. But because not everyone has their name on their participant account with the first and last name, if you are earning CEUs for this and you haven't done this yet, please put your full name in the chat and then put CEU after your name. Okay.
Hey, Pam, before we transition to Gary, I actually just had someone message me and ask for my email address. You're welcome to put that in the chat. It's dlbrown@towson.edu.
D as in Denise, L as in love, Brown. Okay. At towson.edu.
Yep.
Okay, DL Brown, get that space out of there, Pam, and I'm sending this to everyone.
Thanks, Pam.
There it goes. Okay, wonderful. Okay, Gary, I think you can unmute yourself, and we're back to you.
Okay. That was wonderful. Thank you, Denise. So, I was asked to just make some very brief closing comments about what it means to be a white ally. And I certainly don't have all the answers to that question. But I do think that Dr. Brown summed it up when she said, first and foremost, we need to take some risks. And I think there are a lot of white people that have good intentions, but they don't want to make a mistake. They want to stay in a protected zone. And I certainly know that feeling, and I'm familiar with that. But I've had some experiences where I took some risks. And sometimes my ignorance or the fact that I grew up as a white person without the benefits and advantages of having insight and experience to understand what the Black experience is. I was fortunate that I had people like Virginia Harrison who could gently tap me on the shoulder and say, Gary, have you ever thought about it this way? And so I'm a lifelong learner as a white person. And I don't think the journey ends, as you were suggesting today. So find a partner or partners and get support. It's really critical. And there's some great organizations out there right here in Carroll County that will be glad to have you join, to be a participant, and to be a learner. So I know we're almost out of time here. So I want to say two more things. For the CEU participants today, you will get an evaluation that has to be completed, but give us some time in terms of getting certificates back to you, because we still are processing the fees, and we have to work with the Community Foundation account to ensure that everything is accounted for. So that's not going to happen immediately. So don't be alarmed if you don't get your CEU certificate right away. And if you do have further questions, feel free to email me or Amy Baker. And many thanks to Jim Kuntz at McDaniel College, who really allowed us today to have the benefits of getting continuing education units. So the very last thing that I want to do today on behalf of the CCRE steering committee is to recognize our chairperson, Erin Snell. And Erin has done an incredible amount of work with this conference over weeks and months, and to really make it happen on a virtual platform. So Erin, I got a text and I wasn't sure whether you're still zoomed in or you can only listen. But I want you to know that with our love and appreciation, in your honor, we have purchased a heifer goat for a third world family. Now, if those of you who don't know Erin, she has two goats, and I know one of them is sassafras, and I can't remember the name of the other one.
The other one is root beer.
Is what?
Root beer and root beer.
Root beer and
root beer and sassafras.
Right. And so, for those of you that don't know the acronym of GOAT, it is the greatest of all time. And Erin, you are the greatest of all time. And we love you, we thank you, and we celebrate you today. I have just a few minutes before noon. So Pam or Erin, anyone on the steering committee who would like to make a comment, please feel free at this time.
I'm hearing from some folks whose questions I did miss, so I hope that they will reach out to you, Dr. Brown, via your email.
Please feel free to. Yes, definitely. Please feel free to email me.
They somehow got mixed in with some other comments, so I apologize. I think there's only 2 or 3. But please keep your learning going, keep your allyship going. Don't let being tired stop you. Just let it tell you you need to rest for a little while. Because otherwise, as Dr. Brown said, you're going to burn out, and that doesn't help anybody. So please. Oh, and I'm getting emails from Erin. And Erin says that we're all so sweet. And she's sad that she's stuck. I guess she's frozen and she was afraid to do anything because she's got the host computer. So, but she absolutely loves the gift. So she is thrilled with the goat gift. But thank you to Dr. Brown. Thank you to everybody that was here at our peak. We had, I think, 176 people. listening in today. That was the highest number I saw. So congratulations to all of you for spending a couple of hours here on a really important topic. Anybody else on the committee want to say anything? Then I think we can close out. If the committee members would stay on for a few minutes afterwards, after everyone does close out, that would be great.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all again. Yep. Thank you.